and welcome back to my series, How the Gospels Became History, Jesus and Mediterranean Myths. This entire series is based on my book from Yale University Press of 2019. We've gone through chapter by chapter, giving teaser introductions to each and every chapter. I hope you'll have the chance to go back in this series, which is also a playlist, and go through each and every video as you decide whether or not you want to get the book. Today we'll be looking at Chapter 12, Empty Tombs and Translations. And there's a lot of material here. There's also been a lot of interest on resurrection, and particularly the idea of Greek resurrection. I'll just be covering these two themes: the theme of the empty tomb, which is prominent in the Gospels, doesn't appear to be in Paul, but becomes very important to Christian tradition by the late first century. And the idea of translation, which is the idea of bodily disappearance, or a body vanishing and being translated or moved to another place, whether that's another physical location on earth or another location altogether in some other earthly place, whether sort of beyond the confines of the present earth or in a higher realm from which the translated person can then appear on earth as he or she pleases, but their actual existence is in some higher dimension. In this series, I'm going to assume your basic familiarity with the gospel narrative of the empty tomb and the disappearance or movement of the body of Jesus, which can be categorized as a kind of translation. And I want to talk about other Greek figures that experienced something like Jesus. And a lot of these are maybe not so well known. Achilles is, of course, known from Homer's epic, the Iliad, but that only gives a snapshot portrait of Achilles toward the end of the war. It doesn't say anything about the death of Achilles beyond it being prophesied. It also doesn't tell us anything about the afterlife of Achilles. But according to widespread report, and this was in poetry and in prose history, Achilles was killed by Paris, or Alexander if you prefer, and his body was put on the funeral pyre. And his mother, Thetis, who is a sea deity, was mourning there. But she had the opportunity to snatch away his body before it was burned and to remove it to what the Greeks called the White Island, which is probably identical to Snake Island, currently part of Ukraine and somewhat south of Odessa. And the interesting thing about this is, as far as I can tell, Achilles had no earlier relationship with this island. And it's definitely assumed that he doesn't arise there and live there as a dead person. He's not buried on the island. His body, his physical body, was translated away from Troy, hundreds of kilometers away, and re enlivened on Snake Island. And from this location, Achilles was able to show or reveal himself in apparently real and physical form. It was said that a woman who visited the island, who was a descendant of Hector, was literally torn apart by Achilles, and that Achilles had dispersed an invading population said to be Amazons. It's also widespread tradition that Achilles married Helen, which would assume, again, some kind of physical form after his earthly life. And he would appear on the prows of ships and give people instruction as to how to land on the island. He also had an altar and a statue on the island, according to Pausanias, and he basically ruled this region of the sea. So that when the Gospels were written, Achilles was also called Pontarches, or ruler of the sea. At any rate, since these traditions aren't so well known, I'm just going through them point by point. They're collected from various authors in antiquity. And we know that Achilles is worshipped, although, of course, it didn't become as broad as the worship of Jesus. It was quite widespread in several locations of the ancient Mediterranean. So the idea of a hero, whom the Greeks assumed to be historical, really and genuinely dying and then being translated to another location and revealing himself in what seemed to have been physical form, this was not an entirely foreign idea. So that when Jesus disappears from his tomb and in the gospel says that he will appear to his disciples in Galilee, it's not something utterly unique. It's not something completely out of the blue. There were structures and precedents and templates for thinking about how a hero or how a hero's dead body could be translated, re-enlivened, and located in another region. And for this, we have Achilles to thank. Another man who disappeared from his tomb was Numa Pompilius, the second king of Rome, said to be extremely wise and a philosopher in his own right. Numa had two coffins, as it were, and one of the coffins was filled with his books, ancient manuscripts, and the other coffin was his own. It was said to be 8 feet in length and to be sealed with molten lead, and to have been found about 5 centuries or more after Numa's death at the foot of the Uniculum Hill in Rome. And when they opened the coffins, in one of them they found his books, and in the other they found nothing. Although the other coffin that was empty was clearly labeled the coffin of Numa. Now, of course, in a coffin over several centuries, the body does degrade, but the complete loss of the bones suggested that something odd had occurred and that Numa's body had in fact been translated out of the coffin, which gave a sense of numinous quality to Numa and added authority to his books, which were so numinous and powerful they were promptly burned by the Roman Senate. At any rate, here is another example of a figure that occurs in history and a discovery that occurs in historical writing that would indeed seem to indicate that this historical person was translated out of his sealed tomb, in this case, a coffin. And then there is the case of Rome's first king, Romulus himself. And I raise this story because it parallels something that we find in Matthew, that is, the alternative account for how a hero actually was translated or not. Because in the case of Romulus, there were two reports that circulated about how he died. In the first report, he was translated to heaven in the midst of a storm. At the time, he was surrounded by senators, and people ran away in fear due to the thunder and lightning. But the alternative account was that the senators who hated Romulus and his authoritarian and dictatorial ways took advantage of the momentary confusion of the storm and ripped apart the king's body and hid it in their clothes and dispersed themselves. And then, in order to protect themselves, gave out the story that he had ascended to heaven after being translated. And a senator was even said to have seen Romulus descend from heaven in real palpable form, gleaming armor, and give a sort of great commission to the Roman people. So historians recorded both accounts, and obviously, since Romulus was a state god who was renamed Quirinus, they were under some obligation to honor the first story, but they also reported the alternative account as a rumor that had been spread to undermine the senatorial elite and also possibly to undermine the faith of these first Romans. Now, the reason why I find this interesting is because in Matthew's gospel, we have a situation where the author gives the origin story of an alternative account of Jesus's disappearance. He's the only gospel writer to tell us that Jesus's tomb was guarded heavily by Roman soldiers, but that these soldiers had been overwhelmed in the wee hours of the morning by an angel who left these soldiers like dead men. And this apparently, we're not exactly told how, but this allowed for the exit of Jesus from the tomb. And then an alternative report was started by Jesus's enemies among the Jewish leaders, such that the Roman soldiers had fallen asleep and that grave robbers had come and stolen the body. So these two alternative accounts, this is something characteristic of ancient historical writing. In the case of Matthew, it's clear what he wants you to believe, but he's giving you the alternative report in order to help the reader, the ideal reader, to understand that the alternative report was caused by jealousy and political machination, and so to undermine it. But the very fact that he gives an alternative report is something significant and something similar to what we find in the case of Romulus. Now, Christians eventually began to realize that they needed to overcome the objection that the disciples went to the wrong tomb. After all, it was stated in the Gospels that the male disciples, at least, never really saw where Jesus was laid after being crucified. So the idea of them going to the wrong tomb, which was also an empty tomb, was a real possibility. And then reporting the empty tomb when in fact Jesus was in another tomb. And so there was also, or there eventually came to be reported the tomb token of Jesus in what is probably the latest, at least in its first edition, the latest gospel of John, where Peter and John are able to recognize the tomb of Jesus because they recognize his burial clothes and the sindone, or the linen wrapping around the face, neatly folded along the side of the bench where Jesus's body had been laid. This was proof, as it were, physical proof that Jesus had been put in that tomb specifically. And of course, we now have the Shroud of Turin, um, which probably we wouldn't have had if we didn't have this account in John. But the point of having this shroud and this burial cloth is to say that this really was Jesus's tomb, that there was no mistake. But the idea of tomb tokens was actually, it's not unprecedented as a story or a template in Greco-Roman literature. If we think of the case of Alcmena, and Alcmena is the mother of Heracles, she was a famous hero and became more famous after her death. And the assumption of the king of Sparta, Agesilaus, who was a contemporary of Plato in the early 4th century BCE, the assumption was that Agesilaus could break into her tomb, which was marked, and take her body and move it to another location so that he could set up a kind of memorial and shrine to her. But when they broke open the tomb, they found that it was empty. Not completely empty. It had tomb tokens. It had a life size rock that was in place of where the body was. And there were two clay jars as well as a bronze bracelet, which was worthy of a noble woman. So they knew that Alcmena had been there. They thus concluded that she had been translated outside of the tomb and was living somewhere as a deity or demigoddess. So this is my fast track and much summarized version of the chapter. I'm hoping that it will pique your interest so that you go pick up the book and read my detailed descriptions, my notes, my recommendations for further reading. There is an entire book on translations. It's by Richard C. Miller called Resurrection and Reception. And I review this book on my Patreon in case you guys want to know whether it's worth getting. And I've got many other book reviews on the Patreon. So if you join me there, I can respond directly to your comments and your questions. So please consider supporting me there. Till we meet again next time, I wish all of you well, and I thank you so much for stopping by and listening to this video. I hope that you'll give it a like and let me know what you think. As always, take care and be well.